like to see you give an answer to. And then after that, I'll open it up to the audience. We do have a mic. And like I say, you raise your hand, and Mike Fulmer will bring you the speaker, the handheld mic, and speak up very loudly so that we can all hear you, and we'll go from there. But here is another question from your grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
What is the biggest economic issue the next presidential administration is going to face?
This is the Tom Sargent response. Silence. The trouble is there are too many excellent candidates.
Well, can you give us a Bayesian prior on the various outcomes here?
I actually think of the budget deficit as, in some sense, not a big problem, because it's so clear how to solve it. You just got to raise taxes and or cut expenditures, and you got to get the right people in a room and tell them they're going to be shot if they come out with an agreement, without an agreement. Yeah. It's not as if there's a feasibility problem where we don't know how to do that. Harder problems are medical care with an aging population. The treatment people get as they age and get chronic conditions is extremely variable, and it's very unfair even now. If we try to make it fairer, it's going to be expensive. It's a very difficult set of political issues. And as with the budget deficit, we don't seem to be talking about the real issues at all. We're talking about the individual mandate in the Romney-Obama health plan, when that's kind of an implementation issue. It doesn't address the hard problem of can we control costs? And to the extent we can't, how are we going to put limits on how much we spend on old people? Those are really hard problems. And they are economic problems at the root, but they're connected to problems with egalitarianism, weighting young people's welfare versus old people's welfare that are fundamentally political. So those are the big problems that will be there for either administration, no matter what we get. Of course, that's not what what will be perceived as the big problems. What will be perceived as the big problems will be these games of chicken over is the debt limit going to be raised, and that sort of thing. But an economist doesn't really have much to contribute there except to say, what are you thinking?
Don't play chicken, right? Okay, we're going to open up questions to the floor. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you. State your name and your affiliation.
Yes. Carlos Sarazaga, Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. I was a former crisis student at Minnesota many, many years ago. And my question will be related to that old topic. When I was answering to Tom, you said, well, it's not the same to raise P. No, let's think about M plus B over P. Okay, so it's all government debt, regardless of whether it pays interest or not, over P. And you said, doesn't make any difference. It's different if you raise P than if you lower B, in the sense, European governments are essentially saying, I'm going to take away B, right? Not going to pay back. Mm-hmm. So I see this M plus B over P. Who cares whether you decrease the numerator or decrease the numerator or increase the denominator? So I'm not sure why you are saying that it makes a difference, especially from a country for Argentina. We increased P many times, and we didn't do very well.
So you're saying that I'm trying to figure out what you're accusing me of saying. that it doesn't matter whether we do it with P or,
you say that makes a difference. That is not the same if we increase P.
or decreasing. I mean, if you it obviously makes a difference if you decrease B by taxing people, right? I would never say that a tax,
Yeah, but P is a tax.
but P is a tax, but it's to the extent that it's unanticipated. And here, all that matters is unanticipated at the time people buy debt. It's a very neutral tax. But that's not the only thing. I did at one point in this discussion say that the U.S. and that I have an explanation for why the U.S., UK, and Japan are not facing big interest premiums on their debt. In fact, the opposite. Their interest rates seem to be pushed down every time uncertainty in the world increases. Whereas in Europe, the opposite happens. For countries that if you look at debt to GDP ratio or primary deficit to GDP ratio, they don't look as bad as the US and Japan and the UK. And that has to do with the difference between default and inflation. Some people argue that in Japan there's not that much difference, but generally in the US, I think, and certainly you can see this in Europe, the trouble with default is if there's no way to inflate away the debt, and you know it can't be paid, and you're holding the debt, you don't know how default is going to occur. And looking at what's happened to Greek debt, you can see all the uncertainties. Some holders of Greek debt have taken big losses. Others have not taken big losses. Particularly, banks and the IMF haven't, but also some holders of Greek debt held out in the negotiations over how much of a cut they were going to take. And furthermore, most people think that the negotiated reductions in value of the Greek debt are not the end of it. There'll have to be more. You don't know when or how much. And the default can come up at a date when some big issue has to be rolled over. The question will be, what's going to happen? Is it just they're going to say, well, we aren't going to pay this big issue right now, we'll pay it later. And then all the other debt is unaffected, except to the extent markets are worried about the postponement. Or there can be a default where the government says, sorry, there is now a Greek euro, and all our debt that is denominated in euros is actually Greek euros now. And so everybody's debt value drops at the same time. Nobody knows which of these things is going to happen. And that's why you get the big default premiums, because the uncertainty associated is not so much the uncertainty associated with the Greek fiscal effort versus their debt. It's that how the various holders of the debt are going to be stung. That's very uncertain. Whereas in the U.S., you can be worried that that we will not put out the appropriate fiscal effort, but that'll be inflation, which will take place over time, and it'll be everybody understands what that does to the value of different kinds of debt. There's no mystery about what inflation does to debt. So I think that's why. Now in Japan, they have a very complicated structure of gross debt, much bigger than net debt, because they issue debt, and then government agencies like the U.S., like the postal savings agencies, buy the debt and take deposits from the public. So inflation, by lowering the value of the long-term debt that these agencies hold while leaving the deposits unchanged, would actually create defaults for government agencies. So inflation is not so distinct from default in Japan.
Any other questions?
Well, I'm Helmut Lütkepohl from Berlin. I have an affiliation at the Freie Universität, Free University, and also at the DIW, the German Institute of Economic Research. You talked a lot about VAR models and how great they are, and we all know that. But the other big workhorse in macro is, of course, DSGE models. And could you also say perhaps something about them and which of the two tools will be more important in the future perhaps, or in which direction do we develop?
The DSGE being Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium Models for
Right.
the audience, right?
I think of DSGEs as just highly constrained VARs. They're, and they, if you look at the history of how they developed, they actually grew out of structural VARs in that that I and Eichenbaum and Cristiano, Bernanke and some others had, a lot of people had done estimates of structural VARs trying to separate the effects of monetary policy on inflation and output from the feedbacks from inflation and output to monetary policy. And there was sort of a consensus developed there about how you make that separation. And then Cristiano and Eichenbaum proceeded to try to put together an equilibrium model in which they could match the impulse responses of the economy to policy to what was being found from VARs. I actually was annoyed with them at the time because they fit this big model entirely to its response to monetary policy, and I thought their chances were very good they would distort the model. But in the process, they learned what kinds of adjustment costs and frictions they needed to put into the model, where they needed to put shocks in order to get a complete economic story about how the economy was working that matched the stylized facts that had emerged from the structural VAR literature. So these DSGEs aren't really competitors. They all produce impulse responses that look amazingly like VAR impulse, structural VAR impulse responses, but that's because the history of them was they were constructed to match. The advantage of them is that they provide stories that you can tell to policymakers about how the monetary policy works. There's not as detailed a story that comes out of a straight structural VAR. In principle, that ought to lead over time. What I was hoping was that after Smets and Wouters did the first DSGE that was really fit to data and match compared to the fit of structural VAR, that you would see, because I'm sure it's possible, that you could develop alternate DSGEs that had different implications for policy that would also fit. But developing a DSGE is hard, so everybody just does the same thing over and over again. So we have not had as much competition as I would like. And even where we did, I mean, Bernanke and Gertler had put in financial frictions before the big crisis. If you go back and read their paper, they estimate, there's a section that estimates the impulse response to a big financial shock. It looks terrible. It's a big thing, but kind of nobody noticed it because nobody thought financial shocks were that important. So they didn't emphasize that in their paper. And none of the VARs that were actually used in the monetary policy analysis included the financial sector, just because